Good afternoon. I don't think I've ever done a conference where it's due to start at 5 o'clock. And according to that clock, it is exactly 5 o'clock. So well done, the Fabian Society, for running to time. Yeah, give the Fabian Society a round of applause. And this is obviously, I think, the last session of the day. So we are all that stands between you and alcohol. So very much looking forward to this session. Very delighted to be in the UK rather than in America, as I was for the whole 4 years of Donald Trump's first term. So what is going to be happening across the pond? I'm going to ask our wonderful four panellists to introduce themselves and to make a few brief remarks about how they see things, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So why don't we start, Luke, with you at the end? Yep. And you can give your kind of quick hot take on, I mean, you know, from More in Common, I'm fascinated by the polling work you've done and what the read across is to here.
Yeah, so I thought I would focus on what we could learn here from Donald Trump's victory. And I wanted to start by, some of you may have seen, there was a piece that went viral shortly after Donald Trump's general election. And it was from a well-known political strategist called Galinda the Good. And she says, it's not about aptitude, it's the way you're viewed. So it's very shrewd to be very, very popular like me. And why do I start with that? I start with because I think the big lesson from Donald Trump's victory, which progressives the world over should learn, is I think they've gotten so used to fighting populism that they've forgotten how to be popular. And I think that progressives can learn from Galinda in their fight back across the world. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think it was best summed up by the chap that I spoke to in a focus group in the UK this summer, who said to me, you know, the thing is, Keir Starmer, I was quite excited when he came in, but now he's come in and he said, I don't want to be Mr. Popular. But why doesn't he try? Why doesn't he try and be popular? And I think that there is a sense that, you know, progressives, parties of the left, and indeed some centre-right parties are so determined to present themselves as the grown-ups in the room compared to the sort of theatrics of the more populist right, parties like the Republican Party, that they've lost that knack for connection. And it's something that we see across our opinion research. Now, the good thing, I should put in some good news, is we are not the US, thank goodness. In fact, if Kamala Harris had been the candidate here, or if people in the UK had had a vote, if the UK was the 51st state, which seemed outlandish at some point, but I'm sure we're somewhere on Trump's list. The good news is...
It'll be the 52nd after
52nd after Canada, and yeah. I'm not sure what Greenland is going to be, but Kamala Harris would have won 2-1. She would have won almost every demographic and group apart from young men under the age of 35. And there is a bit of a warning sign there, because young men under the age of 35, Donald Trump would have gotten over 50% of the vote with that group. But you know, by and large, we are not the US. We're also not as polarized as the US, which, you know, working for More in Common is kind of a key KPI for me. But across a range of issues, you know, climate change, far less polarized. You know, support for tackling climate change spans the political spectrum. Something like Ukraine. In fact, the UK is almost unique in Western democracies in that we don't have a left-right split on Ukraine and what's happening. So big difference there as well. But I think perhaps the biggest difference, and John and I have spoken about this before, is that in the UK, we don't tend to have, most of the public don't have, what are known as stacked identities. What do I mean by that? I mean, if I sit in on a focus group that my US colleagues are running, and someone says what they think about immigration, I can usually then tell you what they're going to say about abortion, what they're going to say about gun control, what they're going to say about climate change. Brits, on the other hand, wonderfully inconsistent. So, and I will always remember, you know, there was a focus group, there was a guy, he was raving about small boats, you know, he was really cross, thought it was one of the worst things to happen to the country. We then got on to footballers taking the knee, And he said, well, of course footballers should take the knee. We need to get rid of racism, particularly in sport. And I think highly politically engaged people can miss that. And sometimes there can be a tendency on both the left and the right to try and import that very rigid ideological worldview, whereas I think inconsistency could well be what saves us from suffering the fate of some other countries where we've seen the populist right do so well. And just a couple of other things that I'll just throw in for discussion. What do I think progressives need to learn? Ironically, I think progressives need to learn to be a bit more inclusive. Now, in a past life, when I had political views, now I just regurgitate other people's views, I was a conservative special advisor. And I always thought one of the biggest differences, now I spend a lot of my time advising generally progressive movements, is it is so much harder to get people on the left to take people in. So on the right, if you agreed with us about one issue, we would say, that's fine, we don't care that you disagree with us on all of this stuff, but you can join us for this campaign. On the left, it really doesn't seem like that, and it feels to lots of people that unless you pass a whole series of purity tests, you can't be part of the campaign. So we did some polling of progressives, a group, one of the segments of Britain we call progressive activists, and we found that nearly 50% said they wouldn't join a campaign if it had conservatives on the campaign. We found that 30% wouldn't join a campaign that had evangelical Christians on it. 25% wouldn't join a campaign that believed in Israel, with someone who believed in Israel's right to exist. Now, the problem with that is the smaller and smaller, leave aside the specific issues, the smaller and smaller you make that Venn diagram of issues you have to agree with, the harder it is to build a big coalition for change. And I think the Democrats really suffered from that. Much more I could say, but I do want to hand over to some of the others. But I think really focusing on that idea of a more inclusive populism could be the way to progressivism could be the way to tackle populism.
Right. Luke, that was brilliant. Kristin, let me come to you. I keep reading about how Democrats are, and the word that keeps being used is exhausted. The party kind of feels exhausted. I'd love to hear from Democrats Abroad what you think of where we are now.
Sure, and thank you for having me. Democrats Abroad, just so everyone is very clear, I'm the chair of Democrats Abroad UK, and we are an official part of the Democratic Party representing overseas Americans. We have country committees in over 190 countries around the world, and although we draw our constituents from every state in the union, we send votes back home, and that's why our vote as the overseas contingent really matters, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that a bit more. Exhausted? I'm maybe just by my nature as the chair, when my people were down, I'm like, you got to get right straight back up, folks. We don't have time to be exhausted. We've got a big job to do. We have special elections that are going to be coming up literally in just a few months in some of the states. We are still trying to get the state of North Carolina to certify a state Supreme Court election victory for the Democratic candidate. And the Republican candidate right now is challenging the results of the overseas vote. So that is in the courts right now. And of course, in 2027, the entire House of Representatives will be back up for election. We have the chance to take it back, and a third of the Senate. So we don't have time to be licking our wounds and being too tired. We have to get right back up and going. And if I can just say that, for the last 2 years, Democrats, as well as a number of traditional Republicans, were sounding the warning to our fellow Americans and to our allies and friends around the world that this was the most consequential election in our lifetime. And over the last 4 days, I think that has proved itself out in spades. Right now, we have our Constitution, the very foundations of it, being challenged by Donald Trump and his administration. Our history and our values are being rewritten right before our very eyes. The progress we've made on women's rights and on civil rights are completely being torn up. Impartiality in our federal government, something that, by the way, my husband is a civil servant here in the UK, I will say impartiality is the cornerstone of any good government. And The impartiality is now out the window, and in is a requirement to prove your loyalty and your allegiance to Donald Trump and the America First agenda. That is now a condition of employment within our federal government as of, I think it was yesterday or the day before. And our collective future with the United States as the leader of the free world can no longer be counted on. And I think that that is quite significant. But none of this, and I know there's a temptation to kind of look at what has happened, either going back just to the Donald Trump first administration or where we are now. But, you know, one of the key things that Democrats were accused of not doing was not listening. And I, over the course of this election cycle, did probably 50 to 100 interviews against Republicans overseas, which, by the way, is just like a group of Republicans who raise funds for Republican candidates. They are not an official part of the Republican Party. But I was in these interviews, and one thing kept coming up over and over and over again. And there is an organization called the Heritage Foundation. Now, some of you may have heard of that. The Heritage Foundation is a coalition of about 200 think tanks and foundations that had written a document called Project 2025. That document was a 900-page blueprint of how to reimagine, if you will, the federal government and how to rip apart what is our constitutional separation of powers, 3 co-equal branches of government, and consolidate that power largely into the executive branch, i.e. Donald Trump. But he kept saying, my opponent kept saying, but the Democrats are just waking up to this thing. The Heritage Foundation's been around for 40 years. And when we lost this election, I finally thought, I wasn't listening to that. What did I miss? And I went out and did some research. And in fact, he's right. The Heritage Foundation and its blueprint for reimagining a new world order and a new domestic order has been around since the days of Ronald Reagan. And in fact, if you go out and Google Heritage Foundation and Ronald Reagan, you can be taken to a video where you will hear in Ronald Reagan's own voice almost the same narrative that you're hearing from Donald Trump. You're just hearing it from Ronald Reagan. So, you know, there is a lot that we need to reflect on, but as a military history professor of mine said back in the late 1980s, he was talking about the Vietnam War, and he said, we won't know for 40 years what the real lessons were from that war. And so I caveat all of my remarks tonight around there are going to be lessons that will be revealed as time goes on, and the consequences of this election are revealed. But I would like to argue, if I could, just very. Well,
we've got to have time for a panel discussion.
Sure, very happy to.
Yeah, so
we can come back and dig into what I think are the shortcomings. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, I really want to hear from you, Dame Emily. Yeah. As chair of the Foreign.
Thank you. I'm Emily Thornberry. I'm the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I'm not going to pretend that I was happy if Donald Trump got elected. I think that in common with most people in Britain, we were really disappointed. There were a whole load of reasons why we were disappointed. His politics are not our politics. He's unpredictable. I mean, you know, we're used to having presidents of the United States who we kind of know where we are with them. I mean, they vary, but fundamentally they agree with the international rules-based order, largely. And they kind of know that the order of things is that they, on the whole, work with the West. That isn't the way it is now. And it takes quite a lot of adjusting. But I can't help it. I'm still an optimist. I can't help but think, well, it's like not what we wanted. But is there a way that things can be made to work in our favor? Are there some positive things that we can take from this? And I think that having thought about it quite hard over the last few months, I think there are some things. I think the very unpredictability can in itself sometimes be used to people's advantage. I mean, I think what you have to do perhaps at the big outset is work out where your interests allied with Donald Trump's and work on those. But, I mean, there is an unpredictability with, him saying, for example, about Taiwan, asked about what's your policy on Taiwan. And he says, well, I'm not having the Chinese, misbehave, and I can tell you that I'm very unpredictable, and, they don't know what I'm going to do, brackets, I don't know what I'm going to do either. But there is, but I think within that, there is a kind of strength, and we saw it as well with Gaza. In the end, I don't think that there is exactly a cigarette paper that you can put between the deal that Netanyahu signed up to a couple of days before Trump came into office and the one that Biden had crafted and indeed the negotiators had signed up to about 6 or 7 months before. So what's the difference? The difference is having an unpredictable president. Having a president who wants to do deals, and as I say, I think that the approach is to go, yeah, we agree, we want to have deals too. Like, for example, on Ukraine, you want a deal, we want a deal. We want peace, you want peace. So how are we going to do this? We don't want a loser's deal, Donald. You don't want to have your first deal as being the deal of a loser, and a loser means, right? And then you explain what a loser means. So, I would say my bottom line has to be a continued independent Ukraine. So it has to be able to join the EU if it wants to. It has to continue to be on the path to joining NATO. Anything else is essentially Ukraine has lost. And I don't think that America should sign up to that. And then I think there is also something about strength, which, if you're an Inuit in Greenland, that may not be a great thing, but there are other times in which there are other things that are happening, and that perhaps having a reasonable, rational, slowly approach president, for example, on the Middle East just hasn't worked. And maybe a new alternative approach might work. It might not, but I'm an optimist, and we need to be able to make the best of what we now have. And if it means, packaging up a Middle East peace deal and going, here you are, Donald, this is yours. And could you be in the photo? But we do need you to put pressure on the Israelis to sign up to this. And behind the door over there are the Norwegians. They want to give you a peace prize. But could you just... Listen, we've tried everything else. Let's try this. And I, for one, will be wearing a MAGA hat if he does it.
I look forward to that photo call. John.
Hello. Is this what? Yep. Perfect. Firstly, thank you for having me here. As a long-time member of the Fabians, I never really would have thought I would be here speaking. So thank you very much. For those that don't know me, my name is Jovan, and I kind of birthed onto the political scene, I would say, at the election last year, where I contested the parliamentary seat in Clacton against a certain Nigel Farage. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, but I left with so many lessons, and that kind of informs aspects of the work that I'm doing today around this kind of global rise of the right wing, how they're organizing, what the problems they may present to centre-left, social democratic, socialist parties, and how we can organise within our communities to provide some steadfast opposition to it, because I do think it represents some form of social poison, at least in what I saw against me in Clacton, and that's what's motivated me to do a lot of the work that I do now. So unlike Emily, I wasn't surprised to see Donald Trump elected at the last election, in part from my own parliamentary experiences down in Clacton. The unpredictability that you spoke about, quite rightly, I think it speaks to the conditions that so many people have grown up under in the UK and in the United States and across the kind of Western globalized world, where the kind of promises of a social democratic capitalism that yields public services, that yields progressive or kind of inclusive results for many of the population no longer holds as it stands today. And so unpredictability is something that I think people gravitate to because their own lives are unpredictable. And we have to really get behind and understand what is the volatility in many people's lives today, particularly for, I think, working class communities who can at times be the driver for some of this more reactionary politics. And so I'm particularly minded by understanding these things. I've left Clacton with a lot more questions than I had answers. So I hope you don't mind if at times you indulge me in learning about how we can address this issue. But I think we're in quite a concerning place. I think the infrastructure that is developing around the right wing as we understand it, our politics doesn't have the infrastructure to accommodate it as we understand it to be. We still occupy quite a 20th century notion to the world when these people are operating very much in the 21st century. We've got social media. As a young person who navigates social media on a daily basis, it's particularly interesting to see how Trump and Farage and various other kinds are effective in using social media, changing views around masculinity, which I think is particularly curious, or traditional gender roles. This, again, was some of my experiences that I saw in Clacton, which was a bit of a world away from some of my own experiences and my own peer groups. And I was minded then to understand what is the culture that is underpinning a lot of this drive, where has this social democratic breakage occurred, and how can we recapture, reinvigorate the kind of radical idea that created the Labour Party and created social democratic movements around the world in order to bring about a more prosperous and inclusive future.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. We're going to chat here for about 25 minutes. I'm going to open it up to questions after that. Kristin, I slightly cut you short. I'm aware of that. What I want you to, I suppose my central question to you is, why do you think the Democrats lost? And I mean, I don't want to relitigate the whole of the Biden term and whether he pulled out too late and didn't give Kamala Harris enough time. But what were the central issues for you?
So I have boiled this all down to effectively 3, slightly 4 points. And again, first and foremost, the Republicans controlled the narrative. And they controlled this narrative for over 2 years. They told us what the issues were. They told us how our candidate should be defined. They rewrote history as to, you know, they romanticized the first Donald Trump term as peace and prosperity. I confronted this line over and over and over again in those interviews that I did and that were taking place all throughout the nation. And that's what people heard. The other thing, the second point, is that the Republicans controlled the media outlets on which so much of the information is now received by Americans. It's conservative television. Fox News is the primary news source. It's conservative radio, and I want to talk about this very quickly in just a second, but they also controlled Spanish language media, which, you know, Democrats haven't really focused a whole lot on, and became a problem. But when I'm talking about conservative radio, I'm talking about what is happening in the battleground states. I'm from a battleground state, Wisconsin. Twice, Wisconsin was the last state to fall to send Donald Trump into the White House. It sickened me, but it's true. Otherwise, it has a very progressive history. But the newspapers that were available in the state for so long, and that everyone, I was a newspaper carrier when I was a kid. The Wednesday paper was about 4 inches thick. I practically broke my back as a 12-year-old carrying these things. That paper is now down to about 10 pages, and it largely reports out on news coming out of Chicago. Nobody in Wisconsin cares about Chicago. Hate to say it.
I'm going to interrupt you, because we've just got limited time. You don't think that Democrats were kind of just didn't talk about the right issues? I mean, about the economy, about immigration, they were seen as too woke.
The Democrats, and this is I think really important, the Democrats were out busy doing the hard work on immigration. They were out busy doing the hard work on trying to lower costs for everyday Americans, lowering costs of prescription drugs, getting housing costs down, trying to do all the things. And we did not talk about it. We didn't talk about it effectively, and it didn't matter when we did, because these networks of media outlets controlled what people hear. And it is outrage. It is an outrage narrative, to the point where, again, going back to these radio stations, when the newspapers fell away, the radio stations replaced them. And the Republicans in all battleground states focused on these radio stations. and they carry a signal, you never need to change your radio station, and you will hear almost 20 hours of outrage on these radio stations, and the remaining hours are your Green Bay Packers and your Bucks basketball, so you never need to change the radio station. So the final point, Republicans were unconstrained by truth, and Democrats tried very hard to stick to the facts. And it is very difficult to battle mistruths, lies, and claiming of credit where credit was not rightly deserved.
Okay. As someone who's covered it for many years and been involved in a number, I'm going to push back on that because I think that is a very slightly kind of blithe view of what happened in the election. I think that there was you fought a battle when the border not enough had been done about the border. Yes, latterly there had been the bipartisan attempt to get legislation passed, but the border was, it was on everyone's minds. This inflation, which I know the American economy is growing very fast, but people were feeling it in their pocketbooks and when they went to the grocery store and filled up the trolley. I think that Donald Trump's, you talk about the Green Bay Packers, the adverts that Donald Trump ran when football was being played, college football on a Saturday, NFL, and those adverts that Kamala Harris is for them, Donald Trump is for you, really hit home.
So let me and I said that there were 4 points, and the 4th point was the price of eggs and meats, right? Okay, you can't get away from that. But the story of inflation, remember the economy that President Biden inherited from Donald Trump. It was in the tank, right? Inflation was high, nobody was working, and this goes back to my first point. The Republicans successfully got everybody to forget about that. What they were living, to answer the question, were you better off 4 years ago? No, the answer unequivocally was you were not. In immigration at the border, President Biden deported more immigrants than Donald Trump did in his entire first term. So we did not do an effective job of not only responding to the concerns that people rightly had. The Republicans were successful in rewriting our record on it, and we were busy trying to get things done.
Fine. Emily, I just want to come to you. And what do you, you obviously follow these things incredibly closely. You're chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. When you look at what happened in the US in November, and you look at the rise of Farage now, and the rise of reform, and you get the impression that for 100 years, Labour and Tories have looked at each other and been terrified of each other, and now both Labour and Tories are looking at reform and are terrified of reform. What do you think the lessons were from the US?
So I think the lesson number one is, it doesn't matter how good the economy is, as you're saying, if you can't afford everything that's in your trolley at the end of the week, then the economy's terrible. And that's 100%. It's a bit like, if you're unemployed, it doesn't matter how good the employment rates are, it's 100%. And I think that's how people see things, and I think that therefore in those terms, Biden had failed. All governments around the world are suffering from inflation, and they're all tumbling. And the advantage that we have in this country is that we've just had a Labour government elected, and we're going to be in power for 5 years. And in 2 years' time, Keir is going to be an elder statesman internationally because everybody else is going to have changed. And, that's what's going on that level.
What about
So moving on to populism. I think one of the things which I'm getting these kind of flashbacks with Trump at the moment is there's an awful lot of things that, it was Trump himself who said that Boris Johnson was Britain's Trump. And there was a lot that Boris Johnson used to do that, now you see Trump doing it again. The things where he would make a huge fuss about things, and we, in the leadership, the Labour Party, would have to deliberately say, we're not rising to that. And our supporters would go, but that's terrible. I remember doing local authority elections, and I would do a media round, let's say once a week, and I would say, okay, so what are the Tories talking about in relation to trans this week? And what would their attack line is? And everything in my heart and soul, I would want to stand up for trans people who were being victimized and focused on. But actually, it was local elections, and we needed to bring the narrative back to local elections. And that is really hard to do. And when you're dealing with populists, that's what they do deliberately. And you have to kind of stick in your lane and talk about what is, the important things. You have to do it in a way which is interesting and fun and people want to hear. But you also have to not be afraid to say, that's a complicated problem and the answer doesn't come in 4 words.
What do you make to Luke's point, which I thought was really interesting, about how the left, the progressives, can be very exclusionary, that unless you pass the purity test and you are right on all the correct issues, then you can't, the price of admission, you're not coming in. And that actually that's quite alienating, and the populists are seizing on that, as Donald Trump has seized on it in November.
Yeah and not. Because, the other thing that Luke was saying was that there are things which, the populists will say, which really upset ordinary people too. So, some of the stuff like Donald Trump is not popular in the UK. If you look at the...
He's not standing for election in the UK.
No, but nevertheless, if you look at the polling, I think that Donald Trump is least popular in South Korea and second least popular in the UK. There's something there, and I think there's something about the absolutism which I agree with, but what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. It's absolutely, it actually also Farage puts off large numbers of people because of the things that he says, as well as, attracts some people because of the things he says. So we just need to be, of course, what we need to do is that we need to be able to open our arms and encourage people to support us. Of course we do.
But that element of the sort of having to believe in everything. I have found that all, for years in progressive.
Yeah.
And that, if you haven't got the wrong line, and you look at the retreat at the moment in America of DEI policies, where you've got all these corporations that are now abandoning diversity, equity and inclusion policies. You've got Meta saying it's stopping fact-checking. You've got the media itself in full-scale retreat, it feels like, at the moment. And I could enumerate endless examples of that. Is that the way we go in Britain?
No, of course not. We have a different culture. It is not necessary. Listen, you're relating a couple of things. Of course, what you have to do in politics is you have to be as open-armed and welcoming as possible to the public. The idea is that you try to get as many people to support you as possible, and you try not to get involved in this kind of pick-a-side type politics. I say that as somebody who's deeply tribal, and I am very likely to be a pick-a-side person. I try not to. I do know that I falter in that respect. But, of course, that's what you do. But that doesn't mean... I just think you jump too far to say, therefore, somehow or other, because Donald Trump has won an election in America because the economy was bad, i.e. prices were really high, and the public wanted to vote for the businessman who understood about economics. I think it was as simple as that. I think there was more about that than anything else. And I don't think it was because they didn't like the idea of people getting an equal chance at good jobs.
Luke, do you agree with that?
So I'm going to slightly hedge. I agree with the second part, but I don't just think it is enough to say that it was the economy, because what you find in the US and in the UK, particularly when you speak to people who are more attracted to Reform UK or, Trump voters, is there is this profound sense of disrespect from the people in charge, that we have stopped aligning respect with your contribution, going out, playing your part in society, and respect has become about having a degree, living in a big city, being wealthy. And those feelings of disrespect, they span so much, I think, of what is behind the rise of populist movements. We've been doing some work at the moment, particularly with young men, and it is striking when you chat to particularly young men who might be tempted by someone like Andrew Tate, the way that they talk around the fact that they feel like masculinity is now disrespected, that no one stands up for young men or talks about the positives of them. I think Wes was talking about this earlier, the idea that there's a big achievement gap when it comes to young men. There's no one almost got their corner. And what Trump does is he has their corner. What Farage does is he has their corner. And I think the thing which, if I were a member of the Fabians, a member of the Labour Party, that would worry me, that shifted in the UK, and I think it started in the US, you can't do the read across, is before the election there would be people that would say to me in a focus group, I quite like the fact Nigel Farage says it like it is, but, you know, I'm not sure I want him as Prime Minister, and, you know, there's just a few too many rough edges. Those same people, so the kind of soft Farage fans, are now saying to me, well, Tories buggered it up completely. You know, Labour have come in and they're not respecting me anymore, and they've taken away my mum's winter fuel allowance, so I might as well give this Farage chap a try. And I don't just think, you know, I think it would worry me if Labour thinks they can get to 2028 and the economy's growing a bit more, and that kills Nigel Farage. I don't think that's the answer. And I think Biden kind of shows that, right?
Interesting. And Jovan, I mean, I know you're doing this work on kind of populism, what's happened in America, what's happening in the UK. Do you recognise what Luke's just said?
I do, and I pitch it as the decline or the breakdown of the social contract, a bit like what I said earlier. The dream that many of our grandparents or parents may have had in terms of owning a house, a secure job, knowing that there was a pension coming down the line once you finished working, that no longer exists for so many people of my age and below. And it's no surprise that under 35-year-olds, there's a significant uptake in reform voters, also obviously for Trump, and across Europe, similar is happening in Austria, in France. So this isn't unique, and this kind of consensus that we've long promised to ourselves or hoodwinked ourselves that this is a sustainable way of governing or a sustainable way in which we organise society is coming to its wit's end. And so I think that's something that has to be analysed in what is the social contract for today, what is the offering for progressives, for social democrats, for socialists to propose to an electorate to say, well, this is what we have to offer. One of the great things about the Labour Party and the Labour movement was that it was this kind of utopic idea. It was essentially what created the modern welfare state, the kind of Keynesian consensus that we understand today. That was radical at the time, and it speaks to our heritage to be bold, to be innovative, to imagine a world that is alternative to what exists as it stands today. So that is something we have to really incorporate. Alongside a sense of fairness. A lot of people I think fairness is a very British quality and a very British trait. And at least when I was knocking doors in Clacton, there was a deep sense and there was a deep kind of aggravation that people like myself who are knocking doors with a Labour rosette on or with a Tory rosette weren't understanding their concerns in the same way. And so there was this disenfranchisement, this disaffection, as I call it. But it was primarily around the idea that something wasn't fair. The idea, as we saw in Clacton, I mean, sewage was being pumped into the sea, and yet nobody had a say over that, and yet they were paying for the privilege of that happening, or that their benefits were being cut even under the last Tory government, and yet there was no accountability, there was nothing to be said about that. And so re-understanding what is fairness in a modern society. We're multi-ethnic, we've got a range of people from all over the world. We've got to recalibrate what Britain is today and where it's going. Otherwise, the narrative and the storytelling has, as I fear, has been hijacked by Farage and Reform. To me, they're the only ones who are proposing an alternative society. They are the radicals of today, and we need to recapture that. It speaks to the heritage of the Labour movement. I think it speaks to the optimism and utopic view that most British people have of the society. It's up for the left to make the case for one.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I want to have 5 minutes more up here before we open it up on the floor. The question, I suppose, and Emily, are kind of having travelled the world with Trump and been in more rallies and press conferences and been called another beauty by him and all the rest of it. I mean, I absolutely 100% agree with you when you said the way to dealing with Trump is not, you know, for example, on NATO, not to try and give him a lecture about the importance of the Western security umbrella, but say this is your best route to a Nobel Peace Prize. What would be your advice on how to handle the Trump administration if you are the Keir Starmer government? You've got a bloke called Mandelson, I think his name is, going out to be our ambassador to Washington. There are a number of pretty tricky issues ahead.
So I think number one is do your best to avoid the sidekick. I think that, I speak as a mother here.
The sidekick?
The sidekick. So Elon Musk really wants our attention. He really wants our attention, does everything to get our attention. And I just learned that, when your kids are playing up and they want lots of attention, the best thing to do is just look the other way. And I think that it is important that we don't rise to every provocation in relation to Elon Musk, no matter how tempting it is, because I think that just feeds him. So I think that's number one. And I think that whilst that relationship continues, we just need to make sure that we're not provoked, unless he says something which is unsafe, and unless he abuses the algorithm on X so that you just get far-right propaganda put onto X. And I think that there is a case building that he's using that, and if that's right, we need to stop that. But he can say whatever he likes so long as it's largely true. And the best thing to do is to ignore it, my view. And on Trump, I think, as I think I hinted earlier, I think what we need to do is look at where it is that our interests are largely the same, and then try to work with him to make sure that we get a deal. I don't think that we are going to be in his sights when it comes to tariffs in the way that it will be in relation to other countries. I think he begins his negotiations with that in relation to all countries, but I don't think that he needs a great deal from us. And I think that there is he on the whole likes the UK, and it's probably best to keep on that side of things.
And if
but
he tries to
if there are things that we disagree with, and I think the things that are likely to be the problems will be international law, then I think we just stick to who we are and we just say, no, don't agree with you.
And if he tries to frame, it is now a glorious 8.5 years since the madness of Brexit. We still haven't got a trade deal with the United States of America. If we are looking like we are trying to forge a closer relationship with Europe, as the government has said it wants to do, you're going to have Donald Trump saying in the White House, well, hang on, you've got to choose. You can be friends with us or you can be friends with them. He hates the EU.
Yeah, you see, the thing is, is that we're the biggest, we invest more in the United States than any other country in the world. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States that are dependent on British money, and vice versa. And that all happens without a trade deal. And actually, most of our trade is not in stuff, it's in services, because in the end, we're a service economy. And that will continue whether or not we get a trade deal. I think the best thing for us to do, if we're going to have trade negotiations, is to have negotiations with individual states on whether or not they will recognise the qualifications of service providers from the UK, and that will really help with increasing trade. It's not about anything much else. It works perfectly well. And I think the idea of in order to have, if we're going to do it within the World Trade Organization rules, which obviously one might not with Donald Trump, but let's say we want to stick to international law and we stick to the WTO rules. In order to have a trade deal with the United States, it has to be comprehensive, which means it has to cover everything, which means it does have to cover the hormone-injected beef. And the Americans' attitude to trade negotiations is, well, here are our rules, you're going to have them or not? And of course we're not, because we also need to be able to trade with our biggest trading partner, which is Europe. Now, the problem with talking trade, is that because we have given our trading negotiations to the European Union for so many decades, actually most politicians in the UK don't talk trade, don't really get the basics of it. Those of us who've done, whether we liked it or not, did 18 months as Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. I had to get on top of this. But it's just really interesting. You'll talk to sort of New Zealand politicians or whatever, Canadians, and their bread and butter is to understand trade, and it's part of their political discourse, but it hasn't been in the UK. And so whenever we talk trade, we talk like in fantasy terms about, if you're on the right, you talk fantasy terms, everything's going to be fine because we're going to have an all-singing, all-dancing trade deal with Donald Trump, on the one hand. And on the left say, well, all we have to do is have a better trade deal with the European Union. But it is more complicated than that, and I'm sorry, it is.
Kristin, let me come to you on the Musk part of it, about what your advice would be, because, this is of a different scale of anything I have seen compared to Murdoch, William Randolph Hearst, any of the barons of the British press, the Beaver Brooks and the like. We are in new territory where Musk is right in the White House. He's sitting in on the most important calls, and he is putting out. Does this relationship between Musk and Trump last?
It depends on whose ego wins out in this one. But, you know, I think it's deeply disturbing. I mean, and obviously he is being put in charge of this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. I like to call it doggy because it's, you know, that's what I think of it. But anyway, but they, I mean, Elon Musk is there for himself. Make no mistake about it. He wants to get rid of the regulations that he identified as being a blocker to his businesses, whether it was his EV vehicles that, frankly, now I don't know where that's going to go, but you know, whether it was a SpaceX project or whatever else he has going, he is all about how do I make the federal government work to my advantage. And that is a real problem because that means that there may be competition issues that arise from that. I mean, will other EV vehicle makers now suddenly not have the benefits of, you know, having not been first to the market? You are going to see, you know, regulations on safety potentially go right out the window. And never forget, Elon Musk benefited hugely from the NASA investments and from the government contracts that the US government gave him. And now he wants to turn it all to him. So I think it's a real problem. The question, and I think it is really truly the right question that you've asked, is, you know, does power of the presidency win out over power of the purse? And these are two men with huge egos. They will have a falling out. The question is, where does the American electorate lie in all of that? And is actually Elon Musk potentially the next president of the United States, or want to be the next president of the United States after Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, he's got to get rid of the rule that you've got to be born in America.
He does, but it doesn't, I mean, whether it is him or whether it, you know, the influence that he has, I guess, is the point.
My final, would you be as sanguine as Emily is about just let's ignore him? Because I think that he is, there is a menace that is there at the moment to British politics, German politics, US politics.
I think you can't ignore all of it when he's offering $100 million or pounds,
apparently,
whatever it was,
to
the Reform Party. I don't think you can ignore it. And I think that this goes back to, you know, the comment I made earlier about how the Republicans have had this blueprint in place for 40 years. They knew where they were going, and frankly, I think that some of the things that they put into place, they got rid of things like, we had a rule that said in our political discussions, you had to have, you know, fairness, you had to have equal time, equal reporting. Ronald Reagan did away with it, then we got to where we are. You know, the Republicans did a great job of buying a piece of software where they could gerrymander congressional district maps and almost guarantee in certain states that they were going to win the election based on where the lines got drawn after every census that takes place every 10 years.
Right.
So I think you are wise to play a game of looking at the infrastructure, the ways in which your politics are played out, not just looking at who's our candidate and what are our policies and how are we going to talk about it.
Okay, let me try and get a couple of questions. Oh, I can see a hand that went straight up there. I'm going to take you, sir, there, and then we'll take, I don't know whether there's a microphone. Are there microphones? Just shout it out. Go on, stand up. Oh, there's a microphone, fantastic. And then...
Whoa, is it on? Is it
Yeah.
on? Okay, first off, Emily, congratulations on your damehood, and Jovan, great work on your candidacy in Clapton, even though you're trying to compete against me to be the most stylish activist in the whole of the Labour Party, so...
Come on, get on with all your schmoozing.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Emily something. Given we're near the end of the actual conference, I wanted to ask yourself, because it's your 20th year in Parliament, I believe, because you got elected in 2005, what do you think your greatest achievement in the whole of the 20 years has been?
Right, we'll come back to that. We'll take the second question as well, if we can, just here. I'm just worried, I just want to get as many questions in as possible. And the woman there, yeah, you, yes? Yeah, go on.
Very quickly. So I stood in the general election in July. I'm standing in the mayoral election. Reform are probably our biggest threat. In the general election, in some ways, reform helped us, but we are going to have to deal with them. Now, I lived in the States for 10 years, so I do follow American politics, and these people only get elected because people vote for them, and it's kind of taking on what you said, Luke. We have to find a way of reaching their supporters, and I think one mistake the Democrats did make was dismissing the MAGA Republicans, the Trump supporters, as being deluded and kind of vilifying them. We need to find a way of talking. There will be the hardline right wing that you will never get through to, but a lot of their supporters, again, what you were saying about stacked identities, I think it's really important that we find a way that we can address the people who have moved towards reform and bring them back. We can't just, we dismiss them now at our electoral peril.
Right, and I'm going to take the third question there. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, Luke, your point really echo with me. I've never met an individual that I've agreed with 100%, let alone expected that from a political party. But what would you say the Labour Party or the Labour movement in general should do to tackle that issue from within?
Right, fabulous. 3 great questions. Emily, I don't want the full greatest hits album. Just the greatest hit.
So I joined the Labour Party in order to do things collectively. And I don't think that, I can talk about individual things that I did, but actually the biggest achievements that I have been involved in is because I have been involved in politics. And I've done it with the Labour Party. And so Labour's achievements are my achievements, just like it is for everybody else in this room. And so recently my biggest achievement has been getting Labour back into power at last with a big majority. And my job now is to make sure that we use that power well and that we transform our country and that we are bold and we're brave about it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Kristin, do you accept that? Do you accept the second question, that there was too much dismissal of the appeal of MAGA and not really understanding why they were so popular?
I don't necessarily agree, and here's why. The Democrats knew that every single election is razor thin, right? We don't have time or the ability to marginalize anyone. Now, Hillary Clinton's, 2016 deplorables comment that she made, unfortunate, she took it back. We learned that lesson, and in this election cycle, you will only have heard about the denigration of the MAGA movement and the people in that movement as defined by Republicans saying, this is what Democrats are saying about you, as opposed to the Democratic candidates saying that about those MAGA Republicans. And I know you do not agree with me on my comment about that the Republicans controlled the narrative, but when you actually break it down, Kamala Harris was quite clear. She was going to be a president for all Americans. Whenever there was criticism of the actions, she took it on board. She was willing to listen. But we didn't actually denigrate the MAGA movement. What we denigrated was the line that was pervasive throughout the Donald Trump campaign. And we definitely took on the challenges that were put to us about, whether our party had actually done enough to reach out to, the regular voters, because people perceive us now as the party of the elites, when in fact, we were the only party working on behalf of trade unions. We were the only party, as I said, working to bring down everyday costs. Donald Trump has now surrounded himself with billionaires. And guess who got the biggest tax cuts under the first administration? It was the billionaires and the large corporations, of which I worked for one of them. So I'm not anti-business. But what I am saying is that the little guy, right? He thinks, oh, he got a little check. I got my check. My parents, who are MAGA Donald Trump supporters, sent me their Donald Trump check and said, here, on behalf of Donald Trump, here's a little extra for you. And, it was Donald Trump gave me that little bit of an extra tax break. What you got was little. What Donald Trump got was huge, and nobody talked about it. So
Okay.
I'm sorry, I do disagree with that.
Luke, what should Labour do?
Yeah, well, actually, this is quite important, and I think it unites the two questions, actually, because it's interesting. I hear lots of people on the left complaining about, the right wing controlled the media, people watched Fox News, but the Democrats just conceded a whole load of spaces. Kamala didn't go on Joe Rogan. So in answer to your question, part of it is about going to those spaces where you might find your 60% ally. Like, I think, here Labour politicians should be going on GB News. In fact, there was a poll just before the election where actually, Labour was doing pretty well with GB News viewers because it says two things doing that. A says, it allows you to reach people with your message, but secondly, it also says we value you just as much as our Guardian reading base. So that's one point. The second point, I think, is really important about how to do that and build a broad coalition. Language really, really matters here. Now, you can overstate language, but just to give you one example, it's one of I think, the most interesting bits of polling we've done. If you poll the public and say, do you agree with the concept of white privilege? Only the very most progressive segment of the population agrees. If you ask, do people from ethnic minorities suffer disadvantages white people don't, every segment of the population agrees. It's basically saying the same thing, but what you're not doing is rubbing against that person who says, I've never had privilege in my life, how dare you say that I've got privilege, but you're still getting the message across. And again, it allows you to build that bigger tent. And I do think, if you say Kamala was for all Americans, I couldn't really tell you which. I would watch Kamala speeches and I'd be like, I'm just a bit confused. It made for some great memes sometimes, and there was the whole brat thing, whereas Donald Trump, he's going to do this, 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 and this. I know what's there on the tin.
It was said of Hillary Clinton, the 2016 campaign, which I covered, was that Donald Trump had great top lines. Hillary Clinton had no top lines, but a mass of second, third, fourth, and fifth lines. Whereas Donald Trump, I want to build a wall, I want to keep Muslims out, whether you like the policies or not, I want to bring manufacturing jobs back. He had clear headlines and communicated. And I thought that, again, slightly.
Oh, I agree, 100%. He had headlines, and if you asked him to go a level below, he couldn't do it.
Of course.
And his supporters are exactly the same way. Same conversation we have with members of our own family and our friends. I don't like Donald Trump is always what you will hear. I do not like him as a person, but I like his policies. You ask the next question, what are those policies that you like? They can't name them. Don't know. I just know there was peace and prosperity because I've been told that by Fox News. And by the way, can I just say one thing that I'm particularly proud of Democrats Abroad? We have gone on GB News. We've done it. We've decided that we had to be there, and we have sent spokespeople on, and frankly, they were actually pretty gracious to us in the round. So, we kept going back, and and I do think that you are absolutely spot on. We conceded ground. We needed to be more on Fox News. We needed to be in places we weren't. We learned that lesson, and mark my words, we will not make the mistake again.
Go, Emily, do you want a final kind of thought on?
I'm concerned, though, that about this thing about being provoked. And for example, Donald Trump said that he was going to take away American nationality for people who were born in the United States but whose parents didn't have a right to be in the country. And instead of, which I do think, provoking though it is, you have to look the other way, 22, state attorney generals decided to take it all to court and to make a big fight out of it, which of course is exactly what Donald Trump wants, because he wants to frame it as the Democrats are in favor of illegal immigrants and I'm not. And that's, it's wrong on so many levels, all of this. But what we should be doing is we should be saying, we have too much to say, and we have too much that we are doing. But what we do need to do is always think about how does it really affect people on the ground. So we can have the greatest policies, but if people can't see how it actually affects them, and we need to prove that when we're making decisions, that we have them in our mind's eye.
Emily, that's such an interesting point you've just made, and it just begs kind of another question. The thing that has struck me about Trump throughout the last decade that I've been covering him is that people still don't know how to deal with him. And the way you've just framed, it's clearly unconstitutional. It's against the 14th Amendment, what he's proposing to do over birthright citizenship. It's not going to happen, but he's framed, you know, even when Donald Trump loses, he wins. Do you feel you've got the similar challenge here now with Nigel Farage in terms of that, knowing how to deal with him?
I think a little bit. I don't think it's as much as it was, and as I say, I think that we had much more of it under Boris Johnson. And we were just saying earlier, I kind of feel like, you know, we have had the unveiling of Boris Johnson in, you know, and people see him for what he is now. That doesn't mean to say there isn't space for the Nigel Farage to pick up that mantle as well. But the fact that we are a little bit post-populism, I think we need to kind of bear that in mind and take our wins where we get them. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be continuing to be entirely focused on. I think, right, I don't know why it made such a big impact on me, but last Friday I was doing a coffee morning and a woman came in to see me and she talked about the fact that she can't afford to pay for the parking ticket on her street, which she has to buy for a year of. So what she does is she buys a month's worth of daily tickets and she puts them on the car when she needs them. But normally she doesn't need to because she goes to work at 8:30. She takes the children to work, to school, then she goes to work, she comes back after 6 o'clock. She's a single parent, she's got 3 kids. The trouble is that the parking restrictions start at 8 in the morning. So for half an hour, she has to run the gauntlet of whether or not the parking ticket is going to be put on her car. And if it is, that's so much of her weekly income. And it's just like, that's just such a silly little example. But it's like a working woman doing her best for her family, and the system is so completely against her. And it's just like one of those things. And we can talk about as many airy-fairy policies as you like, but somebody is not thinking of her.
Yeah. Jovan, just a very quick final word.
Yeah. So I think we really have to kind of understand what the campaign is, because I think campaigning politics is really essential to this. And I think the Labour Party will have to at times differentiate itself between the Labour government if it seeks to win in places like where you're standing and recognise there are constraints of government, but the Labour Party has a set of values, a kind of vision that it wants to see society move in. In all of what you've said, one of the successes of some of these populist-type characters is that they've created themselves as victims of the establishment where things have not gone their way, and that's been incredibly effective. And we're seeing that with Trump. He's effectively running an anti-establishment government in the heart of the establishment with some of the most establishmentarian characters. And so, as the left, we have to look at that and we say, well, there's great propensity for Farage to do that. Again, I saw some of this on my campaign. He was the insurgent. He was the man who spoke on behalf of working class people and all of their cultural concerns, and the woes in the economy lay at the doorstep of the Labour Party and the Tory Party. If we are to campaign and win over the next 4 years, given we do have a government, I think we have to recognise that we are the Labour Party and we have a particular set of values and visions. Maybe some of the things that we're offering to an electorate that may be somewhat cynical to a government, we have to propose something alternative. And I'm a huge believer in the broad church of the Labour Party, because I think that's where it can speak to the one nation character of our country, to those middle class voters, to those working class voters, and unite them under something progressive. And I think that is something that we have to absolutely champion and celebrate. And I would say that that is the method, at least, of winning elections between now and the next election.
And there, I'm afraid, our hour is up. I reckon we could keep this going for another 2 or 3 hours, and we've sort of barely touched the surface. But all of you, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to this brilliant panel. Thank you.
Thank you.